video, we're going to go through taking apart a Honda F23 engine. We're going to start by taking off the alternator. We're going to loosen up the bolt here that holds the alternator on the engine. We're also going to loosen up the bracket bolts, and then ultimately we'll loosen the adjuster bolt down here. Now that all bolts are loosened, we can take this one off. Take the bolt on the top off. Flip the alternator out. Take this the rest of the way out. And now the alternator comes off. Before we move on, we're going to put this back together so that we don't lose our pieces. The adjuster bolt goes back in. The bolt that holds the alternator on. And the nut that locks it all in place. And all this is only going to be hand tight. Do not use any tools to put it back on. For the next part, we're going to verify that there's no oil in the engine. Down by the oil pan, we're going to take a 17 millimeter and then take out the oil drain plug. Have an oil pan ready, just in case oil does come out. In this case, there is no oil in the engine, so we're going to put the drain plug back in and continue. The next part to take off is going to be the distributor. To take the distributor off, we're going to take all the spark plug wires off first, and then we'll take the bolts off underneath. When you go to take off the spark plug wires, you're going to want to give them a gentle twist, and then lift up. Gentle twist, and now those are all ready to come out. And then on this end, we'll give these a gentle twist. And then we'll set these into the bin. On the distributor, there's two bolts that you're going to take out. One right here, which is a 12 millimeter, and then on the other side, there's a second one that's a 12 millimeter. Now these are special bolts. They have a big collar on the top, so don't lose those. On the other side is our second bolt, and we'll take that out next. Again, it's a 12 millimeter. Now, the distributor is pretty heavy. Once you take these bolts out, it will fall off, so don't drop it. And this is the bolt that goes on the distributor. You see it has a big washer on the top of it. That's the special bolt that goes where the distributor's at. Once you take the bolts out of the distributor, we're going to put them back in their spot. Only hand tight, do not use any tools. The next part we're going to take off is the spark plugs. We've got 4 of them. We're going to use our special spark plug socket, which has the rubber inside it or the magnet inside to hold the spark plug. You're going to want to use a long extension and then a long handled ratchet to take these out. Make sure it's all the way on the spark plug. It's going to take a little bit to snap loose, and then you can spin it out the rest of the way. There's our first spark plug. And we're going to want to keep these in order for when we do the inspection next. So I'm going to set it on my tool cart in the order that they come out of the engine. Make sure it locks onto the spark plug. It's going to take a little bit of a pull. Setting it in order to the right of the first one I took out. Make sure you don't crack your elbow as it snaps loose. And the last one. Verify sound are good. And that's how we take the spark plugs out. Before we go any further, we're going to set our engine to number 1 top dead center. Before any engine's taken apart or has major diagnostic or service work done, you always want to set it to number 1 top dead center to verify any alignment issues, whether it be in the timing system, ignition system, or internal parts of the engine. So on the Honda engines, there's this special tool that fits inside the harmonic balancer, and we're going to use that to rotate it counterclockwise until my alignment mark lines up with the indicator over on this side. Another trick you can do is to take the dipstick tube, and just to see what this looks like, put it inside there, and you're going to see the dipstick tube go up and down as that piston goes up and down. If I were to keep going, you would see the dipstick tube go back down as the piston went back down. Now we have our alignment mark on the harmonic balancer lined up with the indicator on the plastic timing cover. Now we're going to take off the flex plate bolts. And these are a 12-point bolt, and there's 8 of them. You're going to need to use a real shallow socket that also has the 12 points on it. If you try to use 6 points, not going to work. This is also 17 millimeter. I'm going to loosen them all first. And it also helps to have another student put that tool on the harmonic balancer to hold it in place while you crack these loose. Now, if there's a bolt you can't get to, you will have to rotate the engine just a little bit. If you can go down with it. Perfect. There we go. And then make sure it's lined back up before you walk away from it. Now that these are all loose, we'll go ahead and start taking them off. These bolts are unique to the harmonic balancer. These bolts are unique to the flex plate. They got that 12-point tooth on top, 12-point bolt on top, and a real fine thread there. Put on. these bolts are not going to go back in the engine. Everything in the bag. You should not feel the bearing still off. It's real fit on. And what you're starting to see come loose here is the spacer that goes on the flex plate. You want to note that that goes on the outside of the flex plate. So there's the final bolt. There's the spacer. You're going to see a little hole right there, and that lines up with the alignment pin for the flex plate. So when you put it back together, that pin needs to go aligned with that hole. And now that comes off. Now we're going to take off the wiring harness, and this wiring harness has connectors going to the EGR, 4 fuel injectors, and then a part over here that's already cut off. To do this, push down on the tab right here, and then slide off the connector from the EGR. On each of the fuel injectors, in this case on the left side, there's a little tab you're going to push on, and then it'll slide off. There's a little tab right there. Gently push on that, they come off. I'm going to start over on the left. There's one. There's two. I got the third one off. And now the last one. This one's a little tricky to get to, so we're going to start loosening up the wiring harness track. There's a little clip right here. Gently push that in. And that gets you a little bit more room to get this last one. We'll take this tube out of the track. And now we can slide out the wiring harness. Now we're going to remove the fuel rail. The fuel rail is held on by 2 10mm nuts, one here and one on the other side. There's the first nut and the second. When you go to remove the fuel rail, you want to gently pull straight back and gently wiggle it because there's rubber O-rings inside of here, rubber seals, and they need to be pulled off evenly. There it goes. So these are going to be the 4 fuel injectors that spray the fuel into the cylinder. You want to watch for these seals right here. They're a black circle. Make sure those are either still inside the engine or on the actual injector itself. Once the injector rail is removed, we're going to take those 2 10mm nuts and put them back on the stud they came off of. Again, only finger tight, do not use any tools. Now we're going to take off the EGR valve, which stands for exhaust gas recirculation. It's held in place by 2 12mm nuts. You're going to need to use a long extension to be able to get down to them. One on this side, one over on this side. Once you have them loose, you can just spin it off by hands. Go to the other side. And now the EGR valve comes off. We're going to take the two 12mm nuts, thread them back onto the studs they came off of. Again, only finger tight. The next part of our Honda engine that we're going to take off is the cooling tube. And it runs from the front of the engine all the way underneath the intake manifolds up to the thermostat housing over here. We're going to start by taking off the cooling tube that goes up to the throttle body. There's a clamp down here. You're going to use needle nose pliers or regular pliers to squeeze the clamp. And then slide that up the tube. Once that's slid up the tube a little ways, give it a twist, and then it'll pull off. Now that the tube is removed, we're going to take off the bracket bolt right here. Many students like to take off the second and third bolt and leave this one, and then this doesn't come off at all. So we're going to start by taking off this bolt, and it is a 12mm. And we'll set it close by so we can put it back in its spot when we're done. On our thermostat housing, there's two more bolts. One up here, and then it's a little difficult to see, but down here is the other one. These are 12mm. You're going to need to use a long extension to get at them. And this is a longer bolt. And the bottom one. This is also a longer one. Now that that's loose, we'll be able to pull this apart. Gently hold the tube and wiggle the thermostat housing, and then it'll come off. There's a rubber seal that goes around here, and sometimes that seal gets stuck. So that's why you just have to gently wiggle it off. Now that the thermostat housing's off, we can go ahead and take off the cooling tube. Again, gentle twist, and the tube comes off. If you're trying to pull on this and it won't come out, it's because you probably left that bolt in there. Down at the other end, you're going to see a little pin right here. This pin is what aligns it with the little indicator over on the other side and keeps it from going in too far. Now that we have the two thermostat housing bolts removed, we're going to put those back in their spot, finger tight. And they should be two longer bolts, 12mm. And don't forget, you're going to put the cooling tube bolt back in that held the little bracket on right here. It's a short 12mm. The next part we're going to take off is the intake manifold brace. It's held on by two bolts, 12mm, one at the top and a second one down at the bottom. And these are a shorter 12mm bolt. Down at the bottom. And then hold on to that brace so it doesn't fall on your toes. And a second 12mm short bolt. Before we walk away, we're going to take both of these bolts, put them back in their spot. second one at the top. Finger tight. Now we're ready to take off the intake manifold. The intake manifold is held on by quite a few bolts that hold this flange against the cylinder head. There is a special way to take this off, which is much like peeling off a sticker. We're going to start from the outsides and then loosen up the bolts in a spiral pattern towards the center. So we're going to start over here, and then we'll go over to the right. We'll do the top bolts on the right, top bolt on the left, and then we'll work our way in closer. So we're going to crack these all loose first, and then we'll take them all the way off. You will have to use a variety of tools to do this. We're going to start off with a 12mm short socket, and then eventually we'll have to move to a wrench and a 12mm deep socket. So if the current tool you're using doesn't work, you will have to switch it up to be able to access all these. So I'll start with the first one. And all I want to do is loosen it. I'm not going to take it all the way off, just going to crack it loose. Now I'm going to go to the right side of the engine and take off this one. Crack that loose. And now we're going to go to the top side, and this one I cannot access with a ratchet, doesn't quite fit in there. So I'm going to use a ratcheting wrench, or just a regular fixed wrench will also work. Now that one's loose. And I'm going to go to the opposite side of the engine to the front here and loosen this one. And we're going to continue that pattern. Now I'm going to work my way in a little bit closer in a spiral pattern towards the center of the engine. A little bit closer. Now I'm going to go to this one right here underneath it. It's a little difficult to see. And the ratchet doesn't fit on there nice and square. So we're going to switch over to the ratcheting wrench. I'm going to do the same thing on the top side. And now I'm down to my last nut in the center. I'm going to adjust my ratchet to get a little better angle on it. And now they're all loose. At this point, we can go around and start taking all of these off. However, we are always going to leave the last one in the middle for last. So the one that's on top, in the middle, leave that for last, because we're going to have a second person hold this. It's really heavy, and if you take all of them off, it's going to fall off onto your feet. Now this one, the whole stud came out. That's okay. When we put it back together, we'll just make sure to put this one back in that spot. But the top of the stud got a little rusted, and so the nut stayed stuck on and the whole stud came out. Not a problem. And I'm leaving that top middle one for last, so that this doesn't fall off on my feet. All right, and now it's ready to be lifted off. Before we walk away, we're going to take all of the nuts and the one stud, and we're going to put that back where they came from. And you'll notice all of these are a different color. They're kind of a golden brass color. These are the ones that go on the intake manifold. The next part we're ready to take off is going to be the exhaust manifold. Now the exhaust manifold has a heat shield on it, and we need to start by taking that off first. There's 3 bolts, 12 millimeter, and you'll see they got kind of a rusty color with the big washer. That's how you know they're the right bolts for this spot. But we're going to start by taking those off. And the edge of this metal can be sharp, so be careful on that. And don't set this too far away, because when we're all done, we're going to put it back on here for storage. Okay. Now that the heat shield's off, we're ready to start taking off the remainder of the bolts. Down here are 2 bolts that are a little bracket that support the exhaust manifold. Those are 14 millimeters. And now we're ready to take off the bolts that hold the exhaust manifold onto the cylinder head. Just like the intake manifold side, we're going to start on the outside and work our way inside. And you can see it a little better on this one. Just like you'd be peeling off a sticker, we're going to start on the outside, swirl our way in. And this is going to be a 12 millimeter. Just like before, we're going to leave one of the 2 center ones for last, so that we don't drop the center foot. And you'll see this one, the whole stud came out. That's okay, we'll just put it back in that spot. And what I'll point out is these nuts have the little castle portion up here, which help these lock on for the high vibration, high heat, keep them from coming loose. So you know they're the right one when they have the little slot up there. Now I'm holding on to this so that I don't drop it on my foot, and then we can slide this off. And before we walk away, we're going to take all of the nuts in the one stud and thread them back on by hand. We'll put that together. Take that on simple. And then this is the one that was used for the brace. We're going to put that back in here on the block. Before we put our exhaust manifold away, we're going to put the heat shield back on it because it's going to stay off for quite a while and we have to store them all in a cart. So we're going to put this back together with the heat shield back on it and the brace bracket back on it. This bolt is going to go through the side and then attach to the side of the exhaust manifold. Now the heat shield goes on. Again, these edges can be sharp, so be careful with those. Line up the holes and then thread them in by hand. These are not going to go in your bin for storage. We're going to set these off to the side. The next part to remove is the harmonic balancer right here. The way you remove this is you have to use the rotating holding tool It's got a little recess that it fits into. And then we're going to take a 19 millimeter to loosen the bolt that's in the center. This is on really tight, so you're going to have to use two people, one to hold the bar and the other one to rotate the nut with the socket. If you don't have the person holding this, all you're going to do is sit there and rotate the engine round and round. You'll never actually get it loose. All right, go ahead and take that off. And now the harmonic balancer bolt comes out. This should just slide off by hand. And that's all there is to it. Now that the harmonic balancer has been removed, we're going to take the bolts and thread it back in. There is a key right here, a woodruff key, that you don't want to lose, and this is a good way to hold that in place while you're working on the engine. So gently, by hand, don't put any pressure on it, just thread it in. That'll hold that key in place for right now. The next part to remove is going to be the dipstick and dipstick tube. There's one 10 millimeter bolt right here that we're going to take off. And this is a really tiny little bolt that has a little washer on top of it. Swing the dipstick out, and then a little wiggle, and then it'll come out. We're going to take the tiny 10 millimeter bolt and thread that back in. The next part that we're going to remove is the valve cover up on top here. There are 5 screws that hold it in place, so we'll start taking those off. They are 10 millimeter, and be gentle with these because they are really long and they do break off real easy. So if you have your ratchet set in the wrong position, for example on instead of off, you will break these off. Don't do that. Now that all 5 of those valve cover bolts are loose, this will wiggle off. And now you can see the inside of the engine there. Inside the engine, we've got our camshaft going down the middle, and now you can start to see all the rocker arms and the valves and valve springs. Now we're going to take off the upper timing cover. It's held on by 2 10 millimeter screws. And these are unique. They've got a collar on them that takes up the space of the plastic so you don't crack the plastic. So you want to make sure these get put back in the correct spot. And now the upper timing belt cover is going to come off. There we go. Slide it towards you, towards the front of the engine a little bit, and then it comes off. So it just kind of locks in place down there with a little bit of a tab. Going to take those 2 screws, put them back in their spot. It does get confusing as we get to the front area of the engine. There's going to be a lot of different types of fasteners that hold this together, and they all will intermix. They all go into their same screw size. So make sure you put them back exactly where they came from. You'll see what I mean as we go a little bit further along here. It's easy to mix and match. Now we're ready to take off the lower timing belt cover. Before we start taking off the bolts around the edge, we need to take off the timing belt tensioner bolts. That's going to be a 14 millimeter. And now that that's been removed, we can go around and start taking off the bolts on the outside. These are going to be 10 millimeter again. And they also have that collar. So whenever you see this collar on it, that means it goes to the plastic timing belt cover. And we've got several more along the bottom. And with the last one removed, now the lower timing belt cover will come off to expose all of our timing components. As always, we're going to take the 5 bolts that hold on the lower timing belt cover and put those back in their spot. And this is where I'm going to point out how confusing this starts getting, because all of these different bolts are all the same size. They're all 10 millimeter, yet they're all different. So putting these back in their place is critical to having fun putting this engine back together. And if you get confused, like I just was, take a look at your cover again. You can see just to the left is where it goes, just to the right is where it goes. Now is the time to take your time and make sure you put these back where they go, otherwise it gets significantly worse a lot quicker. And then up here at the top, and then also on the other side. If we follow this around up here, you'll see one more. And we're going to take the nut that holds our timing belt tensioner tight and thread that back on. Only hand tight. Don't use tools.
Good.
Yep, does work. Now that we have both of the timing covers off, we're ready to verify that we have our engine timing in the correct location. Starting up top, you're going to see where it says up. You want to make sure the camshaft has up pointed to the top. You're going to see on the left side a little indicator mark, on the right side a little indicator mark. These should line up horizontal with the top of where the valve cover would sit right here on the cylinder head. As we move further down, on our crankshaft, there's an indicator right here that has a little arrow that should be pointing up at the 12 o'clock position. And then going in a little more detail, on the left side, on our balancer shaft, you're going to see a little line right here that aligns with the arrow on this side. There's also one that we'll look at closer later. There's a little notch up here that lines up with the mark. And over on this side, there's going to be 2 little indents that line up with marks on the cover right there. So a lot of different timing marks, but once you understand what they're supposed to correlate with, it's actually really easy to line everything back up and reassemble this engine. So key points are camshaft is pointing up, crankshaft is pointing up, lines up with the arrow on the case, and then up here, we'll look at it a little closer later, that this lines up with the little indicator on the case. Now we're ready to start taking off our balancer belts and our timing belts. It's actually not as hard as it looks. What we're going to start by doing is taking off this nut, and don't lose the washer either. We're going to take that off, 10 millimeter. And this screw is unique to this spot, and I'll show you why. It has a little shoulder right there, not as much as the ones for the timing cover, just a little shoulder, And that's what allows this tensioner to adjust and hold tension the correct way. We're going to take the spring off. And before I do anything with this, I'm just going to put it right back where it came from. That is unique to that spot. And we're going to have a piece of wire ready to go. And start putting all of this onto the wire. So washer's going to go on first. We'll throw this guy on there. We're going to take this wheel, take that off, and just set that to the side. And I'm starting to have a lot of stuff in my hands, so the spring that I took off, that's also going to go on the piece of wire. And this way I don't lose anything. It all goes back in the right order. Now you can see the balancer belt is loose at this point. When you slide it off, you could just grab it and pull it off, but the correct way to do it is going to be to go to the gear without a face on it, and now you can just slide this forward and you're going to see it comes off really easy. This isn't the time that it's a big deal. It's when you go to put it back together. You always want to start on this one where you don't have the edge right there, and this allows you to slide it on and off really easy. So you're always going to take it off, put it back on this gear without the face on it. Now the balancer belt comes off, and we're able to take off one more part. Right here, we're going to take off the gear down here. Balancer pulley on the crankshaft. This should slide off. And we'll put this back in there. And now the balancer belt has been removed. All right. Stop there. Now that the balancer belt has been removed, we've got a lot more access to be able to take off the timing belt right here. And you can see how it runs around, goes from the crankshaft down at the bottom, up around the camshaft, around the water pump, tensioner, back down to the crankshaft. To remove this, we're going to loosen the screw right here, and this is what holds tension. You don't have to take it all the way out, just loosen it. Push down. We're going to switch the ratchet on. Push down and tighten it. What that's going to do is it just took all the tension off of my timing belt, which is going to make removing it significantly easier. We're going to start by sliding it off here. And if you need to, you can go to the tensioner, slide that off, and now the belt comes off. At this point, we can go ahead and remove the tensioner before we lose any more pieces. Loosen the bolt, take it all the way off, and it's 10 millimeter. Take the spring off, and now the whole tensioner slides out. Something I want to point out, you're going to see a hole right here, and you're going to see a little peg right there. Whenever you go to reassemble this, you want to make sure that hole goes into the peg. If it doesn't line up, it's not going to hold tension right, and it's not going to go back together right. We are going to take the wire, and we're going to thread all of this on there in the same order that it came off. Turn this, thread that through. Now you can see that's just like it was on the engine. The spring, I'm going to slide that onto the wire so I don't lose it, and then twist our wire together. Now we will not lose any pieces, and they're all in the order that they came off the engine. We're going to take this screw. It's got to be a short one, not one of the long screws. One of the short ones. Thread that back in. And the nut that holds the tensioner in place will go back on also. Finger tight only. All right. At this point, we're going to remove the cylinder head. The cylinder head is held on by 10 large bolts. You're going to need a unique socket for it. It is a 14 millimeter socket, but it's 12 points. These bolts are all 12-point. So the 6-point socket, it'll actually go on there, and it'll kind of hold till you put some pressure, and then it strips them out. So make sure you're using the 12-point socket. It also helps to have an extension and a breaker bar, as these are on really tight. Now, when you have an engine on a stand and you're working on taking off bolts that are really tight, you don't want to pull towards the front of the stand. What you want to do is put the breaker bar on there, put your foot against the back of the stands, and then use that as a leverage point to pull towards yourself. You never want to push, otherwise you might become Superman and go flying across the shop once the bolt breaks loose. So put your foot on the engine stands, use that as a lever point, and now you can twist. And you're going to go 90 degrees. We don't want to loosen these all the way, we just want to crack them loose 90 degrees so that we don't warp a cylinder head. We're going to go around in a spiral pattern, starting on the outside, just like we did for the intake manifolds and exhaust manifolds. So that one's loose. Put my foot on the engine stand, rotate 90 degrees, and stop. Over to the opposite side. Rotate 90 degrees and stop. And back to the side of the engine, 90 degrees. 90 degrees. And stay on a little bit rough. Make sure socket all the way on the head of the bolt. 90 degrees. 90 and 90. Now, you might have to go around a second time and do the same thing. If they were really tight, if they were at the proper torque spec, which they should be, you're going to have to go around a second time and loosen them all up just a little bit more so that this cylinder head stays nice and true. All right, at this point, I'm going to stop and point something out while I still have your attention. This cylinder head's really heavy. If you take all of these bolts out, currently the engine is sitting on an angle, what is going to happen? It's going to fall off and it's going to land on your foot down here. So, for the sake of making this video, we have it on a little bit of an angle. I'm going to straighten it up just a little bit more here so that it's nice and straight. I want yours perfectly straight up and down. When you take yours out, your engine should be like that. And actually, we're going to make ours like that. Now that you saw where those were all at, we're going to leave ours straight up and down just like you're supposed to. And now we're ready to take out all of these bolts. There's 1, 2, and you can see at this point they're hand tight, so it's fine just to go around and take them all out. And they do have a lot of thread on them. They need to be really strong to hold that cylinder head in place. Now, if you're running out of time in the class period and you're not able to get this lifted off the engine and put away, you're always going to tighten down these center 2 bolts so that the cylinder head doesn't fall off if somebody accidentally rotates the engine. So if you can't 100% take this off right now, you're going to tighten these 2 bolts back up just to hold it in place until the next class period. And now I can start lifting these off. You're going to see it's a long bolt. It's got a washer that doesn't come off. It stays on there. So we're going to take all of these out. And the last group working did a good job. There's actually oil on it, and that's how it should be. And this one is longer than the rest of them. If I hold that up, so there's only one of those, and it goes on the intake manifold side of the engine. And there are all of our cylinder head bolts. I'll set them down. Yeah, kill the camera. When you're ready to lift the cylinder head off the engine, you're going to use 2 people. And what I want to point out down here are there are 2 alignment pins. There's one here and there's one on the other side. I want you to take these out so they don't get lost. Sometimes they do get stuck, in which case call the teacher over and we'll use some needle nose pliers to pull those out so they don't get bent up. It is heavy. I prefer that 2 students lift the cylinder head, and then when you put it over on the shelf for storage.
Needle nose over there.
There we go. So we'll take these out so we don't lose them, and then we're going to take a piece of wire and we're going to attach it to the camshaft gear up top. Ready? This is the head gasket. That is also going to come off, and then we're going to set this off to the side so that it's not damaged. Now we're going to take the oil pan off the engine. There's quite a few fasteners. They're all 10 millimeter that hold the oil pan onto the bottom of the engine block. We're going to start by going around and just cracking them all loose, and then we'll take them all out. The two that we're going to leave for last are right here, which are nuts that are on a stud. We're going to leave those for last and take all the bolts out first. I'm going to crack it loose, but not take it out. And now I'm going to go around and take them all out of the engine. And it's helpful to have a magnetic bowl to set them in, since there are quite a few of these. And you'll see these are the short 10 millimeters. And a long extension with a deep socket makes this a lot easier. And this is the one with the nut on it. We're going to leave that for last. And this one, we're going to take the bolts. And now that everything's removed, now we can go ahead and take these guys off. Since it's on an angle, I'm going to take out the bottom one first. And then the top one. And the oil pan is going to be glued on with RTV or Permatex, so it's not going to just fall off. At this point, you're going to have to use a one of the scrapers or an oil pan remover to actually take this off the engine.
Hot mess. Here you go.
Now that all the fasteners for the oil pan are removed, double check that you've taken off the nuts that are on these studs right there. Now what we have to do is separate the oil pan from the bottom of the block. A lot of the older cars used cork or rubber gaskets, but all the newer cars are using Permatex or RTV to seal the pan to the block. So to separate that, we're going to put this big scraper in there. And the secret is you don't want to drive down into the aluminum block and scrape it all up. You want to be as level as you can and just kind of let the wedging action start to separate it. You also don't want to leverage up and down because that will bend the corner of the oil pan. And once you get to a certain point, you just stop, and then we go to a different corner. Good still?
Yep.
And you don't want to drive it in too far because there are components inside of the oil pan that you don't want to damage. Now we'll hit the last corner and it'll probably start coming loose. And you can hear the sound change. It is starting to loosen up. There it goes. Now we can remove our pan. Now that the oil pan's been removed, you can see the black Permatex that's left behind, and that's the seal that keeps the oil from leaking out. You don't want to damage the aluminum block by using razor blades. You want to use a plastic scraper and go in and start slowly taking off all the remaining sealant that's left. After the big chunks are removed, you might need to take a little bit of brake cleaner or gasket remover to get the remainder off. But you're going to go all the way around the engine, cleaning this up as best you can get it, and you'll know it's good when you see all the shiny silver that's left. We're also going to clean up the oil pan. So you can start by taking this over to the solvent tank, rinse it all out. You can see all the sludge and nastiness in the bottom there. We need to go around and get all the Permatex off of the edges. So we'll start by scraping all the big stuff off. And then we'll follow that up with a little bit of brake cleaner on some Scotch-Brite pad to get the remainder off. Yep. At this point, you should have this all nice and cleaned up, and then we're going to go ahead and put our bolts back in. Just put them in a few turns just so they don't get lost. And while you're at it, take a look at these. Make sure they're all the same size. All of your bolts should be equal length, obviously 10 millimeter. If they're not, let your teacher know so that we can get you the right size fasteners. All right, all the fasteners are back in, so we won't lose them, and we're ready to move on to the next step.
Nope.
All right, so now we're ready to go ahead and take off our crank position sensors. There's 2 bolts right here, and then there's 2 bolts on the other side. Something I want to point out is these sensors have a little bolt on one side and a little plastic peg on the other side that goes into a hole that we'll see in a minute. Make sure when you reassemble, that peg goes into the hole. Same thing on this one. There's a little peg down there. Make sure that goes in. Also, you'll see how this piece of plastic fits nicely across the bottom. That one was installed correctly. So you want to make sure that it's that way to begin with, but also when you put it back together, that this lip curls around. Do not try to remove this right now. You'll see it's loose, but if you force it, then you end up cracking it. You have to take off the sensors first before you can get the gear off. So we're going to take our 10 millimeter. For almost everything we're about to do, it helps to have a deep socket with an extension. None of these should be on very tight, and you want to be very organized with how you take these off. Once again, it's very easy to mix and match. You can see all these different fasteners, and almost all of them will go into each other's spots. So we need to stay organized right now. So take this one off. And now you can see the peg right there, and you can see the hole that it goes into. I'm not even going to let go of this. I'm going to put it right back in the spot. And hand tight. I'm going to take this one off next. The other side. And you'll see all these are coming loose real easily, and that's how it should be. Even from the factory, they're not tight at all. And now we can take off this bracket. Do not move forward until you put that back. I'm going to grab the first one I took out, put that back. Maybe. And now we're ready to take off the other side of the crank position sensor. And you see that plastic peg right there and the opening that it goes into. And there's a little rubber seal right there, and this just gently wiggles out, and now you've taken off the whole crank position sensor system. Now we're going to work our way up to the balancer gear. This one has a gear on the inside that reverses its direction of rotation, so that's why there's a gear on this side. On the inside we'll see a second one over there. And for these, we're going to need 12 millimeter. This one we can leave alone. That was from our tensioner. That stays put. And I'm going to crack them all loose first so that it comes off evenly. And then you'll see back hidden here is a 10 millimeter. Now that they're all loose, I can just spin them out. You're going to see this is a medium length 10 millimeter. It's not a short one, but it's not one of the longer ones. Medium length. This is a long 12 millimeter. Now I'm just going to use a socket since it's easier to reach it. You can see it's also a long 12 millimeter, and these two bolts are the same. .12 millimeter nut. And now this will wiggle and come off. Do not take screwdrivers, pry bars, anything like that. If you can't simply gently slide this off, something is not right. That's pretty ugly inside of there, but that's what it looks like. We've got a gear over here, gear on this side, and this is what reverses the direction of rotation of our balancer shaft. You can see that side? Something I'm going to point out, since it was hard to see in the video, when we go to put this back together, you're going to see there's two alignment indicators right there, and there's also two indents right here. When you reassemble it, those two need to line up. Now that we've removed the balancer gears here, we're going to put our fasteners back in, hand tight. We're not ready yet to take the rest of this off. So we're going to put these in. Until we are. And if your fingers don't fit into that little spot, just use your socket. And then that's 12 millimeter nut. Now we're going to go ahead and take off the water pump at the top. We've got 10 millimeter bolts all the way around, and this one right here, it looks like it's hidden and you can't get to it, but you can actually use a deep socket and reach through this bracket, through this engine mount to access it. So I'm going to go ahead and start with that one. And I'm going to crack these all loose first so that it comes off nice and evenly. This is also a fastener. It's where our spring connected to before, but we still have to take it out. You've got a medium length 10 millimeter. Another medium length 10 millimeter. The long pin for the spring. Now this should come off. You'll have to fight with this screw a little bit, but it'll come out. There it is. Medium length, 10 millimeter. That's our water pump. As this piece spins, it creates the pressure within our cooling system to help circulate the coolant around the engine. This is going to be the seal that keeps the coolant inside the engine. Now we're going to put our fasteners back in place. And this is where it gets really confusing because I've got 3 of these medium length 10 millimeters and 1 pin. Pin's going to go right there. And these take up the rest of the spots. That was for... And then the last one will go there. We're now ready to take off the balancer shaft, and in order to do this, we need to take out the bolt that's in the center right here. If we try to turn the bolt, all it's going to do is spin the balancer shaft. So there's a trick to taking these out, which is on the side is an access port. So we take this bolt out, and it's only a 12 millimeter, but it's a pretty fat bolt. And then you take a screwdriver, and as the balancer shaft spins, there's actually a hole through it, and when you line up the screwdriver with the hole, that's going to hold it in place. So it's not all the way in. There it goes. And now as I try to turn this bolt, you'll see the screwdriver's holding it in place and it's not going to spin. As you push on this, don't bust your knuckles on these bolts. And it's not going to come loose, so we're going to stop and get a longer ratchet. And we'll try again. There it goes. With the longer ratchet, I move my knuckles out of the way, so I'm not going to hit that. And we'll keep the screwdriver there while we take this fastener, this bolt all the way out. And it has a washer on it, and it's one of the longer 12 millimeters. This gear will come off now. And you're going to see a little slot right here. And that slot lines up with a pin that's right there. And now we need to take the washer off. And same thing with the washer, there's a little slot. I'm going to spin it over to this side so you can see a little better. There's a little slot right there. We have to line that up with the pin. And now the washer will come off. There we go. And there you can see the little slot that's in the washer. Now we can take the screwdriver out. Put the plug screw back in. Still good? And then take the bolts with this washer on it and put this back in. Now this pin right here will move up and down if you're not careful. So you want to make sure that the pin is sticking up when you put this back in. If the bolt doesn't want to go in, sometimes that pin gets knocked down and then the screw messes it all up. So just like that, lightly hold it in place. As we move across the engine here, now we can go ahead and take off the crankshaft gear. And there's a pin that's going to come out, woodruff key I should say, and we want to set this to the side for right now so we don't lose it. We can take our crankshaft gear off. And now we can take the gear off of the other balancer shaft. There's a hole in the side right here that you can put the screwdriver through. You can use that to hold it while you take the bolt out of the center. And this screw has a really fat washer on it, and that's the only one that goes to this. It won't fit, it'll fit a lot of other places, but the one with the big washer goes on the balancer shaft. This will come off. Set it to the side, and then put this back in its spot for right now.
Go.
Now we're ready to take off the oil pickup tube right here, and it's held in place with 2 bolts right there, and then 2 nuts on this part where it connects up to the oil pump. And something I'll point out that causes a lot of confusion, there are 2 bolts that hold on this little plate right here. Those use the big washer. There's one here also. The ones that hold on the oil pickup tube do not use the washer. So the washers go over here. The ones without a washer go on the oil pickup tube. And something that commonly happens when students go to take these off is they drop them and they end up falling down inside the engine. Not the end of the world if it does, but try to hang on to those so they don't end up inside the engine. Now this one, the whole stud came out, which does sometimes happen, not a big deal. We'll just put it back together in the same spot. Now the oil pickup tube comes off. On the inside there you'll see a little mesh screen. That's where it filters out some of the bigger debris before it would get sucked up into the oil pump. And before we put those screws back in, we need to take these other 2 off. And now the oil baffle plate comes off. We'll put these back in where they came from. Again, the bolts with the big washers go towards the center of the engine. And then the 2 regular ones without the washer go here. And then finally, over by the oil pump are going to be the 2 nuts. We're now ready to take off the rear main seal. There's a rubber seal right here that keeps oil from leaking out past the crankshaft, and there are 10 10mm bolts that hold this in place. They are tricky to get to. If a regular 3/8 ratchet with a regular 10mm socket doesn't work, sometimes we use a ratcheting wrench, or sometimes we got the quarter-inch drive stuff. We'll see if we can access all of these with this one here. I'm going to crack them all loose first. And you just have to be patient, take your time, try and figure out what works the best. And the ones down here on the bottom are kind of trickiest to get, so you might have to rotate your engine to access them. All right, now that they're all loose, spin them out the rest of the way. And these are 10mm. And if you're able to socket on there, sometimes helps. Some of these are recessed in a little bit, and they're a little tricky to get your fingers on. And if you can put just a little pressure on the back of the socket with one hand and then spin with the other, makes it a little easier to get a lot of these out. Now to take this off all the way, you're going to have to use the tool that I don't like seeing you guys use, which is a pry bar. When you use the pry bar, you want to be really gentle. If all of your fasteners are out, this will slide off fairly easily, but if you've accidentally forgotten one of the screws in there, which is easy to do because you can't see it very well, you'll end up cracking the rear main seal. There's little tabs. There's one right here. There's a second one right here. those are the parts that you want to pry on so that you don't damage the actual seal itself. And you'll see it's sliding off real easy. A little too hard to do just by hand, but a pry bar makes it real easy. And now you have the rear main seal. And then just like before, you're going to go through and put all 10 of your fasteners back in where they came from. And just 2 or 3 turns is plenty to keep them from falling back out. Now, 2 of these holes look like screws should go into them, but they're actually alignment pins. So if you're trying to put a screw into these 2 spots and the screw won't go in, it'll want to start to go in, but it won't actually thread in. It's because it's for the alignment pins and the screw's not going to work there. All right, now they're all back in place and we're ready to move on to our next part. All right, things are starting to get exciting now. We are ready to take off the oil pump and front main seal. It's all integrated into one piece. I said at the beginning, this is where it starts to get real confusing, and it's confusing because look at all the fasteners that we have here. Some of them we've already taken off, others we need to take off now. The trick to this is going around the outside and looking for the screws that are remaining. All of them are going to be on the outside of this shape. So we'll get started. A deep 10mm socket with an extension is the tool of the trade here. I'm going to crack them loose. And you'll see I'm just going around the outside of it. Another one there. These we've already taken out, but there's one more down here. These we can leave alone. These were for the cover. That's for the cover. This is for the cover. That's for the cover. But this other corner one I need to take out. And now I've cracked them all loose. So now I'm going to go around and spin these all out. I'm going to set this up here so you can see what it's like. And I'm going to put these actually in the shape that it's in so I know exactly where they go. These are different length screws, so they're not going to be all the same. These bottom 2 are going to be long ones. So they're very long, 10mm. I'll take off the other bottom one. And those also break really easy. If you over tighten this when you reassemble it, those will break off. Now I'm going to work my way around and start taking the remaining 10mm fasteners off. These are a medium length. And one of the things I noticed is they have a little bit of portion here that's not threaded, and that's how you know it goes to this front cover. This long 12mm bolt is going to have to come out. We'll leave this one here next. This 12mm nut will have to come off. And then this 12mm bolt down here is going to have to come out. Running out of real estate in this bowl. And what you'll notice is these 2 are actually the same, and these 2 at the bottom are the same, and the rest of them are the same. So as long as you get them back in the right spot, they'll all be okay. Now we're ready to take off this front cover. The front cover has several spots where you can pry on it with the pry bar. Right here, there's a little tab that you can put a pry bar on and gently rock the cover off. Same thing on the other side. Over here is a little tab, and then down here is a little tab, so you can put a pry bar in there without warping or distorting it or denting it too much. Now that it's loose, I'm going to slide this off. And sometimes that balancer shaft wants to come with it, just push it back in. And now our front cover is off. And that's what it looks like on the interior side. Going to hand that off. And now, I'm sure you know what's coming. We need to put all these back in the spots they came from. Because I laid them out in a nice order here, it makes this a lot easier. I'm going to start with my bottom two long ones. They go down here. And now I'm just going to start working my way around with the rest of these. And if you take the time to do this and lay it out real nicely, you'll fit yourself and do it back together. You're going to see it's really easy. Or at least much easier than if you put all this stuff in one bin. Now you notice this one just went all the way in. Clearly that's not the right spot for it. There it goes. Now right here and right here are my two bigger 12mm bolts. And finally, the 12mm nut goes back on the stud. And that's it. You did it. You took off the front cover. Probably one of the more challenging parts of this engine.
Go.
We're now ready to take out the balancer shafts. We've got two of them, one on each side of the engine. This one simply slides out. And basically these uneven weights are what oppose the engine forces to help smooth things out. And we're going to leave our screw on the end that has that little washer right there. The other side is held in place with a little retainer right here. Looks like a little half moon, crescent moon. 10mm bolts, as usual. We'll spin these out. And these are short ones. They're really, really short 10mm bolts. Same thing with that one, really short. And now this retainer will come off. Or you'll drop it on the floor. And now this balancer is ready to slide out. We're going to take our retainer and then just put that back in place. The short 10mm bolts will hold it in there. And now you've removed the balancer shafts. Now we're getting into the heart and soul of the engine here. We're ready to take off the bed plate, which then gives us access to the crankshaft and pistons. Now this piece gives the bottom end of the engine a lot of structural integrity, a lot of strength, and we've got quite a few fasteners to take off to do this. It is critical, absolutely critical, that you start by taking off the 10mm bolts first. All these along the outside edge of the bed plate. If you start with the big ones, they will all snap off, and then you're going to have a teacher that is not happy at all. So make sure you start with the outside, take all the 10mm off first, and then we'll go do the bigger bolts on the inside. Just like on the intake manifold, the exhaust manifolds, we are going to start on the outside and then swirl our way in towards the center so we do this nice and evenly. So I'm going to crack this one loose first. And these are not on very tight. It's kind of surprising. It doesn't take much torque to loosen them. Now I'm going to go one step closer to the center. And finally, the center ones. Now that I've cracked them all loose, I can spin them out. And these are going to be a longer 10 millimeter bolt. Look at that magnet. And just to stay organized so we don't drop or lose any of these, we'll use the magnet bowl. And you'll see all of these are the same size. Hands are getting greasy. We'll switch over to the ratchet and speed this up a little bit. Yeah. Now once this last one is out, the bed plate is still not going to come out because these big bolts are holding it in place, and we'll go ahead and take them out next. Just go ahead and stop it and then we'll restart it and run out.
Good.
So now we did things correctly and we took out those 10 millimeter bolts all the way around the outside. Now we're ready to start taking out the bigger 14 millimeter bolts, the heavy duty guys that are in the center. Just like before, we're going to crack them loose 90 degrees, starting on the outside, and then working our way in. These are on pretty tight, so we're going to put our foot on the back of the engine stands, and then we're going to pull towards ourselves so that you don't stress the bolts supporting the engine any more than they need to be. So we're going to take our 14 millimeter and pull 90 degrees. We're just going to take the pressure off, crack it loose, and do this nice and evenly so that we don't warp the bed plate. Make sure it's seated all the way on there. You'll see this engine's had a rough life. It's a little rusty. I want to make sure it's all the way on the bolt. So the outside four done. Now I'm going to move in. And pull towards myself so that it slips. I'm going to come in, go across the room. All right, and now all those are loosened up. And we're going to speed things up and switch over to the 3/8 ratchet. Socket with an extension makes this a little easier to spin them off the rest of the way. Where else? All right, all of the 14 millimeter bed plate bolts are removed, and we're ready to go ahead and pry this piece off. I'm going to rotate this up so that we don't drop it. Can you still see it good? And just on the edge here, I'll do it over on this side so you can see a little better. You're just going to gently rock it up and down with the pry bar. Don't use your fingers for this part. It's really sharp in here. It will slice your fingers. And now you'll see that it's loosened. As long as you do this nice and evenly, you won't damage anything. And now the bed plate comes up. What you want to make sure once you lift this up is that all of your bearings stay in place. A lot of times they fall off or they get stuck on the crankshaft. Just make sure all those are there, which they are. So life is good. We're going to set this off to the side and move on.
Good.
Now that we've got the bed plate removed and set off to the side, we're going to take the small 10 millimeter long bolts and put them back in their spot. At this point, we're going to leave out the big bolts because we need to get the crankshaft out and they get in the way of that. So they're going to go in a Ziploc bag and get set off to the side. But these guys are going to go back in place. And you'll know what identifies these bottom bolts as the correct one is they have a big non-threaded portion on them. And the only place these go is down here by the crankshaft in the bed plate. All right.
Go.
Before we go and take our pistons out, we want to mark them. Pistons need to go back in the same spot, same cylinder. Also, the cap needs to be going in the same direction. So what I'm going to do is go through and mark these so that I know where they go back when we reassemble it. Since 2 and 3 are currently at the top, I'm going to mark those first. So I'm marking the top and bottom, the connecting rod cap, and then the piston connecting rod. That's a 2, 3, and if it's difficult to turn, you could put the harmonic balancer back on and rotate it using the tool. Generally, it's easy enough that you can just rotate it by hand. And now we'll do this side. 1, 1, and 4, 4. You do have to be careful if you start cleaning this that you don't wash off the paint marker, but that gives you an idea that these need to be marked for their location.
Do it.
Now we're in the home stretch. Time to start taking our pistons out. A lot of people struggle with this part because they don't know a little trick, which is we're going to start by cracking these loose. And this is a 10 millimeter 12-point socket, so it fits on our 12-point bolt right there. Just like most of our other stuff, we're going to crack this loose. And these are on pretty tight. 90 degrees, 90 degrees, and now that'll come loose. What we're not going to do is take them all the way out. We're going to loosen it up a few turns. And you'll see it start to separate there. We're going to take a plastic hammer. Don't use a metal hammer, a plastic hammer, and we're going to give it a light tap. And what that just did is it separated the connecting rod cap from the connecting rod, and now it makes this real easy to take apart. Take these bolts the rest of the way out. And the cap comes off nice and easy. When you take this off, make sure the bearing stays in there. A lot of times this falls off and stays on the crankshaft. Make sure it comes off with the connecting rod cap. Set that off to the side. And now we can push our piston out the bottom. We're going to push it all the way out. Make sure your hand is underneath the engine so you can catch it. And we're going to take our connecting rod cap and reassemble it. You can see I've got a 4 and a 4, so those are the right spot for each other. And then tighten up the connecting rod cap bolts. The next cylinder that's easiest to get to is cylinder number 1. Loose at 90 degrees. Loose at 90 degrees. 90. 90. Now it's nice and easy. Loosen it till I see a gap there. Take the hammer, gentle tap. Now we'll take these the rest of the way out. Take the cap off. Making sure the bearing stayed there. And now we can push this out the bottom of the engine. Make sure your hand is underneath. The bearing is still there. It's not stuck to the crankshaft. And put these back together. This is marked with a 1 and a 1. Now I can rotate my engine and bring number 2 and 3 to the top. Degrees, 90 degrees, 79, 90, 90. And I forgot to that use some back down. Now that we've loosened those up, we're going to tap it loose. Same thing on the other side. They're both loosened up, a little gap. And now we can take them all the way out. Put my hand underneath, gently push down. Put that console lined up, and I notice right here it's actually missing the bearing. I don't see it inside there, which means this, we put it back together, put the bearing in there. Naughty, naughty. That has the number 2 on it, and cylinder number 3. That one has the bearing unit, so that's good. We're about ready to take the crankshaft out, and before we do that, I want to point out the thrust bearings that are right here. It looks like they would be in between every cylinder, but they're only in between cylinders 3 and cylinder 4. Right here, these little half circle pieces, and that's what keeps the crankshaft from having too much front to back play. When you take this out, a lot of times these fall out. They can also get spun out, and that's what it looks like. So when these pieces fall out on the floor, you want to pick them up and then add them to your bag so that they don't get lost. But that is going to be your thrust bearing. So we're going to get ready now to lift the crankshaft out. It is really heavy, and I want you to have 2 people do this. So one person is going to grab the front of it. I'm going to grab the back where the flex plate goes. And then we're going to set it back in the bed plate. And don't smash your fingers, so everything's really sharp. And I'm going to find the other thrust washer that fell down in there.